Late. Tim McIndoe.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Before I focus on the 2011 budget, may I briefly echo the heartfelt condolences expressed by my friend and benchmate Pesita Samlotwayenga, member for Mangakirkir, to the family and friends of Philemon Gilland, who was so tragically killed in the water main explosion in Onehunga on Saturday morning. I also extend my prayers and best wishes for a speedy recovery to the other water care workers who were injured in that incident, although we know that the consequences were devastating for Ian Winson, who was so critically injured, and for his family. And I'm sure that the thoughts of all members of this House are with those families at this distressing time. I certainly know that there is considerable sympathy for them all in my electorate of Hamilton West. Mr Speaker, my constituents are also conscious of the very challenging circumstances that made the preparation of this year's budget so difficult. Members opposite do not want to acknowledge the fact, but New Zealanders understand that a zero budget was the only responsible option this year, and the measures that the Minister of Finance announced 2.5 weeks ago are widely supported. Many of my constituents have told me that the budget's focus on building faster growth, rebuilding Christchurch, increasing national savings, reining in government debt while continuing to protect the most vulnerable New Zealanders, and investing significantly more in health and education and creating sustainable jobs built on savings, exports and productive investment is exactly the right prescription for nursing the New Zealand economy back to good health. It's a budget, Mr Speaker, that I will be very proud to campaign on in the run-up to our general election on the 26th of November. I'm proud that we're on track to achieve economic growth of 4% in 2012, with 170,000 new jobs being created by the year 2015. I'm proud that at a time of essential restraint, we've nevertheless invested an extra $4 billion in frontline public services in areas such as health, education and supporting our young people into jobs. That again is very welcome in Hamilton, where we have a large number of youth who need that assistance. And I'm proud, Mr Speaker, that at a time of a record deficit, some of it caused by the tragic events in Christchurch, some of it by the global recession, and much of it by the irresponsible tax and spend obsession of the previous Labour administration, which squandered the best economic conditions any government has enjoyed for a generation. The government's average net weekly borrowing requirement will fall by over 2/3 to about $100 million a week by this time next year, and within about 3.5 years the government will start repaying the debt. Mr Speaker, most members of this House will have met with constituents who have suffered the distressing experience of losing hard-earned savings, in some cases essential savings required for an imminent retirement, through the collapse of a spate of finance companies in recent times. While we can't overcome that heartbreak, we can and must provide more attractive and safer investment opportunities for New Zealanders who want to do all they can to provide a better future and a secure retirement for themselves and for their families. That's why I support the extension of the mixed ownership model to 4 state-owned energy companies that the government has signalled, and the reduction in the government's majority shareholding in Air New Zealand, to enable more of my constituents and those of other members to invest in those important companies, with the equally important proviso that the government will retain a majority stake in all 5 companies, and local investors will be at the front of the queue for the shares. Not only will this offer better investment options for our citizens, it will also free up between $5 and $7 billion to pay for high-priority new capital investment in future budgets and reduce further government borrowing. Far from disposing of state assets, as our opponents like to cry, it's an intelligent option to enable us to acquire essential new ones and fund the growth that we all desire and depend upon. I want now to turn my attention to some important health and education initiatives that were announced by the Minister of Finance. This year's budget is delivering an extra $2.2 billion to public health services over the next 4 years. That is a substantial sum of money, and it includes an additional $585 million of initiatives in the next fiscal year. In my electorate, news of the $54.5 million for maternity initiatives to improve safety and quality and extra well child visits has been particularly welcomed, as we know how crucial it is to provide support for, in particular, first-time mothers as they learn to cope with the huge change to their lifestyle that having a baby totally dependent upon them places on them. I want to pay a very warm tribute to the Waikato District Health Board in my own area, which is already making great use of the extra funding that has been allocated in the previous two budgets to tackle the huge challenge of elective surgery. And they have made a very significant gain in reducing local waiting lists. So I'm really delighted that there's a further $68 million for more elective surgery in this year's budget, which will continue that record increase of 4,000 extra operations a year that we've seen around the country and further reduce those waiting times. I know that New Zealanders warmly welcome that focus. It was one of the core principles that we campaigned on in the last election, and New Zealanders are delighted that we are delivering. Mr. Speaker, for some time I've been concerned about the ability of our health providers and our social service agencies, and indeed those who live with people with this condition, to meet the many demands that a growing incidence of dementia in our community places on them. For everybody living with the condition, dementia is a very challenging and often deeply distressing experience. In my own area, over the last 18 months, I have been supporting in every way that I can and encouraging the wonderful team who have been re-establishing the Alzheimer's New Zealand Waikato branch. It met with considerable difficulties and in fact went out of existence at a time when in the fourth largest city in the country we were seeing a greatly increasing incidence of dementia and Alzheimer's disease. So I'm absolutely delighted to report that Alzheimer's New Zealand Waikato is back up and running. They have achieved a huge amount in very challenging circumstances in a very short period of time, and I thank them for that, and also for those who are enabling them to raise the essential funding to continue their important work. This year's budget allocated an extra $44 million over 4 years to look after people living with dementia, including $40 million for residential dementia services and $4 million for additional respite care, including in-home respite for full-time carers of people with dementia. Certainly I've had some experience of that within my own extended family, and I'm sure most other members will, and I know that this initiative will be warmly welcomed. Mr. Speaker, the news is equally good in the field of education. Schools and early childhood education will receive an extra $1.4 billion in their operating and capital funding out to the year 2014-15, with total education spending rising to a record $12.2 billion in the next year. Mr. Speaker, that's a significant sum of money, but it's also in an area where we know that there will never be enough. So, the extra schools operating funding, the extra funding of $550.3 million for early childhood education, which I particularly welcome, the extra $66.5 million to increase the number of trades academies and service academies, and more are all very good news. And I close simply by saying how delighted I was to be able to attend the launch of the Waikato Trades Academies a couple of months ago. This is a partnership between Wintec, the Waikato Institute of Polytechnic in my electorate, where there are 2 campuses, and 12 schools throughout my region, where there are now a large number of young people being given an opportunity to learn a trade and to develop skills and further literacy and numeracy, all of which will provide them for the modern workforce. For too long we've seen too many of these young people not provided for and leaving school too early, often ill-equipped to cope with anything other than the most menial job, and we know that there are very few of those around in the modern economy. So I salute Wintec and all the schools that have signed up into the program, and I salute our Education Minister, who is doing a wonderful job in providing these opportunities. Mr. Speaker, it continues the efforts that have been put in by our Social Welfare Minister, our Social Development Minister, over a considerable period of time now to support young people into jobs, and I'm pleased to report there's another $55.2 million in the budget for that purpose. And with $15 million more now for other employment assistance programs, the balance in this budget is the right one. The prescription is the right one. Mr. Speaker, I'm proud to support this budget and I commend it to the House.
Honourable